Nestled in the heart of an affluent suburb on the outskirts of a sprawling American metropolis lies Oakwood Estates, a neighborhood celebrated for its immaculate lawns, artfully designed homes, and a sense of harmony that seems almost too perfect to be real. Every street is lined with towering oak trees whose broad canopies offer shade to freshly manicured gardens, and every house stands as a testament to refined taste, with architectural details that reflect a blend of classic elegance and modern sophistication. At first glance, Oakwood Estates appears to be a haven of tranquility and order, a place where every detail is meticulously planned and every rule is followed without question. Yet beneath this veneer of perfection simmers a tension born of overzealous control and the ever-present shadow of conformity. At the helm of this rigidly maintained community is the Homeowners Association, HOA, a governing body that enforces a strict code of conduct covering everything from the colors of your front door to the precise shape of your hedges. The HOA's influence is absolute, and its rules are delivered not as friendly guidelines, but as uncompromising edicts meant to ensure that every resident contributes to the collective image of a flawless community. In this environment, individuality is often sacrificed at the altar of uniformity, and the residents have learned, sometimes too late, that personal expression can come at a steep price. Among the residents of Oakwood Estates is John Miller, a middle-aged homeowner who stands in stark contrast to the cookie-cutter perfection that his neighbors dutifully maintain. John is a man of quiet dignity and a deep-seated love for freedom, a freedom that is reflected in both his approach to life and the modest yet character-filled home he calls his own. Unlike the polished exteriors of many of his neighbors, John's property exudes a natural, unrefined charm. His garden, though slightly wilder than those of surrounding lawns, bursts with a riot of colors from a variety of wildflowers and native shrubs that have grown freely over the years. An old, majestic oak tree, passed down through generations, dominates his backyard, its sprawling branches a living reminder of the legacy and the deep personal history attached to the land. John cherishes every inch of his property, not just for its monetary value, but for the sense of history and personal freedom it represents. He recalls childhood summers spent playing under the dappled shade of that ancient oak, the laughter of family gatherings echoing in the warm summer air, and the pride of watching his garden evolve naturally, unbound by the strictures of manicured design. For John, his land is more than a piece of real estate. It is an extension of his identity, a sacred space where he can breathe freely, express himself without restraint, and honor the memories of those who came before him. However, not everyone in Oakwood Estates shares John's appreciation for natural beauty and personal liberty. Enter Karen, a self-appointed arbiter of order and aesthetics, and one of the most influential members of the HOA. Karen is a woman in her mid-40s with an air of authority that borders on imperious. With her impeccably styled hair, sharp business attire, and a piercing gaze that seems to scrutinize every detail, Karen has built her reputation on her unwavering commitment to the HOA's principles. She sees herself as the guardian of the community's standards, a necessary force to keep the neighborhood's appearance pristine and its residents in line. For Karen, the world is divided into two distinct categories: those who adhere to the established order and those who deviate from it. In her eyes, any departure from the prescribed norm is not only an aesthetic offense but also a moral failing. It is this belief that has driven her to become one of the most vocal and relentless enforcers of the HOA's regulations. Whether it is the size of a mailbox, the style of a garden ornament, or even more contentious, the layout of a property's boundaries, Karen spares no detail in her quest to eliminate any sign of nonconformity. The seeds of conflict between John and Karen were sown long before any overt confrontation took place. It was a warm spring morning when John first noticed something amiss along the edge of his property. As he stepped outside with a steaming cup of coffee in hand, his eyes fell upon an unexpected sight. A section of his once familiar boundary had been altered overnight. A new, stark barrier, an imposing fence constructed without any consultation or warning, had been installed, effectively encroaching upon a part of his cherished garden. Attached to this barrier was a meticulously typed notice, embossed with the HOA's official seal, declaring that the encroached land was no longer in compliance with the community's rigorous standards. The notice cited vague reasons of aesthetic consistency and safety concerns. Yet to John, it reeked of an abuse of power. In his mind, this was not merely a matter of enforcing rules. It was a deliberate act of intimidation aimed at quashing his individual freedom. He recalled past conversations with neighbors, who hesitantly mentioned Karen's recent string of similar interventions in other parts of the community. But while others had chosen to remain silent for fear of retribution, John felt an overwhelming urge to stand up for what he believed was right. His right to maintain the natural integrity of his land, and by extension, his personal freedom. As John grappled with a mix of disbelief and indignation, he began to trace the origins of the fence. The design was not random. It bore the unmistakable hallmarks of the HOA's corporate style, its clean lines and uniform panels echoing the rigid structure of the community's regulations. The fence, which stood a daunting 20 feet tall, was meant to be both a physical and symbolic barrier, a stark reminder of the boundaries imposed by a system that valued uniformity over individuality. John's inner turmoil grew with each passing hour. He wandered through his property, his thoughts a tumult of memories and a burning desire for justice. Every step he took was punctuated by the rustle of leaves and the soft whispers of a past that seemed to be slipping away under the weight of bureaucratic overreach. The natural beauty of his garden, once a source of joy and solace, now stood as a battleground between personal expression and the cold, calculated imposition of rules. At the heart of this upheaval was Karen. Her decision to appropriate part of John's land was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of a long-standing crusade against what she perceived as disorder. To Karen, John's wild garden was an affront to the meticulously planned aesthetic of Oakwood Estates. In her view, every resident was obliged to conform, and any deviation, no matter how harmless or heartfelt, was a threat to the community's collective image. Karen's actions, however well-intentioned they might have seemed to her, were a flagrant violation of John's rights and a stark embodiment of the oppressive rigidity that had come to define the HOA's rule. In the days that followed, whispers of discontent began to circulate among the residents of Oakwood Estates. While many were reluctant to confront Karen's authority directly, the growing murmur of disapproval hinted at a broader undercurrent of frustration. For some, John's plight resonated as a symbol of the struggle between individual liberty and the ever-tightening grip of an overbearing institution. For others, it served as a cautionary tale of the price one might pay when personal expression is sacrificed at the altar of conformity. Yet, amidst the quiet murmurs and cautious glances, John remained resolute. He knew that this was not merely about a strip of land. It was about the fundamental right to govern one's own space, to preserve a legacy that was deeply intertwined with his identity, and to challenge an authority that had overstepped its bounds. As he stared out at the new barrier encroaching on his sanctuary, a spark of defiance ignited within him. Little did he know that this act of blatant imposition would soon spiral into a conflict that would shake the very foundations of Oakwood Estates and force every resident to confront the true cost of perfection. In this pristine yet perilous world of Oakwood Estates, the clash between personal freedom and rigid conformity had only just begun. With the imposing fence as a constant reminder of what was at stake, John Miller found himself standing at the crossroads of defiance and submission, an ordinary man poised to challenge an extraordinary power. And so, the stage was set for a battle not only over land but over the very soul of a community that prized order above all else. In the weeks following the erection of the imposing fence, John Miller found himself engulfed in a whirlwind of indignation and turmoil. The shock of discovering that a significant portion of his cherished land had been commandeered without any form of dialogue left him reeling. Every day, as he walked along the boundary of his property, the cold, unyielding panels of the 20-foot wall loomed like a constant reminder of a power imbalance that was as unjust as it was sudden. For John, this was more than just an encroachment on physical space. It was a deliberate affront to his very identity. His land was the repository of memories, the keeper of family history, and the symbol of his autonomy. The wall's stark presence severed not only his garden but also the intimate connection he felt with the land. The abrupt transformation of his once harmonious property into a divided battleground stoked the flames of anger within him. He could not understand how a community that prided itself on perfection could allow such a violation of personal freedom to occur under the guise of aesthetic consistency and safety concerns. News of the wall spread quickly among the residents of Oakwood Estates. Conversations that had once centered around weekend barbecues and the latest garden trends now turned to whispers of injustice. In hushed tones at neighborhood gatherings and over garden fences, neighbors expressed their shock and sympathy for John's plight. However, an overwhelming sense of trepidation permeated these discussions. Many residents had long learned that questioning the decisions of the Homeowners Association, HOA, was a risky endeavor. The HOA, and particularly its most formidable enforcer, Karen, commanded a level of authority that left little room for dissent. In the eyes of many, speaking out against the association could invite unwanted scrutiny or even retaliation. Karen, a figure who had become synonymous with the HOA's draconian measures, wasted no time in seizing the opportunity to justify the intervention. At a hastily arranged HOA meeting, she stood before the community with an air of resolute superiority. Dressed immaculately in tailored business attire and armed with an arsenal of regulatory language, she outlined her rationale with unwavering conviction. According to Karen, the changes implemented were not arbitrary but necessary measures designed to preserve the community's pristine appearance and uphold its strict standards. She argued that every homeowner had a duty to conform, and that deviations, no matter how sentimental or personal, were a threat to the collective integrity of Oakwood Estates. During her speech, Karen's tone was unyielding and sharp. "We must all remember," she declared, her voice rising in a crescendo that filled the room, "that our community thrives on uniformity and order. Any deviation from these established norms is unacceptable." Her words, delivered with a cold efficiency, resonated with some of the more conservative members of the community, while simultaneously alienating those who valued individuality and personal freedom. For John, Karen's public denunciation was not just an assault on his property rights, but a direct challenge to his values and the sanctity of his personal history. Stung by these accusations and the blatant misuse of authority, John embarked on a quest for justice. He began to delve into legal documents and property laws, seeking to understand how his rights had been so callously disregarded. Late nights found him poring over legal texts and community bylaws in his study, each page deepening his resolve. He soon discovered that the HOA's actions were on shaky legal ground. The regulations that Karen had so fervently invoked were not as ironclad as they appeared. There were numerous precedents and clauses that clearly supported a homeowner's right to a fair hearing before any drastic changes could be imposed on their property. Yet, as John began to arm himself with knowledge, he quickly encountered a labyrinth of bureaucratic red tape. The HOA's legal team was well-versed in navigating the intricacies of local ordinances, and they had crafted a system that allowed them to operate with minimal oversight. Any attempt to challenge their decisions would inevitably lead to a protracted legal battle, a battle that, in the eyes of many neighbors, was best avoided. This realization brought an added layer of complexity to John's struggle. On one hand, his sense of injustice demanded that he fight back. On the other, the potential cost, both financial and social, was daunting. The tension within Oakwood Estates reached a fever pitch as the days turned into weeks. At community gatherings, the subject of John's conflict with the HOA became a recurring theme. Some residents expressed silent support through sympathetic glances and subtle nods, while others maintained a cautious distance, fearful of drawing the ire of Karen and her allies. The social fabric of the neighborhood, once tightly woven with trust and mutual respect, began to fray under the strain of conflicting loyalties and the omnipresent shadow of the HOA's influence. One particularly tense evening, during a neighborhood potluck held in the community's shared park, the conversation once again gravitated towards the growing dispute. Amid the clinking of glasses and the murmur of subdued voices, a small group of residents, those who had dared to voice their concerns privately, gathered in a secluded corner. There, John found himself at the center of an impromptu discussion about the balance between individual rights and communal regulations. "It's not just about my land," one neighbor confided, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. "It's about our freedom to live as we see fit. Today it's John's garden. Tomorrow it could be any one of us. The sentiment was shared by all present, fueling a quiet, yet potent, undercurrent of rebellion against an institution that had long reigned unchecked. However, despite the growing support, the atmosphere was charged with an inescapable sense of foreboding. The sheer power of the HOA, reinforced by Karen's unyielding determination, made it clear that any form of organized dissent would be met with formidable resistance. Karen's subsequent actions only served to underscore this fact. In a series of sharply worded newsletters and public announcements, she reminded the community of the responsibilities that came with homeownership and the consequences of failing to comply with the association standards. Each message was a thinly veiled warning to those who might dare challenge the status quo. As the situation escalated, John's internal conflict deepened. He was caught between the desire to stand firm in defense of his rights and the nagging fear of the long, arduous battle that lay ahead. He consulted with legal experts, whose advice, though encouraging, also painted a picture of a complex and uncertain legal landscape. The notion that he might have to face a drawn-out court case, with all the attendant stress and financial burden, was intimidating. Yet, every time he looked at the towering wall that encroached upon his sanctuary, his resolve was only strengthened. John's determination began to rub off on a few other homeowners who had remained on the fringes of the dispute. In quiet, clandestine meetings held late at night or in the privacy of their homes, a small but growing group of residents began to exchange ideas about how to assert their rights. Their discussions were fraught with both hope and apprehension. They recognized that challenging the HOA could potentially transform the community for the better, fostering an environment where individual rights were respected over blind conformity. But the risk was palpable. Any misstep could result in severe repercussions, not only for themselves but for the entire community. In the midst of this brewing rebellion, Karen remained unyielding. She doubled down on her rhetoric, positioning herself as the sole custodian of the community's values. Her public appearances grew more frequent, and her criticisms more personal. In a particularly charged town hall meeting, she directly confronted John, accusing him of being selfish and disruptive. "Your actions," she declared with a cold, calculating stare, "threaten the very foundation of our community's order. We cannot allow individual whims to undermine the collective good." The words stung deeply, not only because they were a public denouncement, but also because they encapsulated the fundamental divide between two very different visions of what life in Oakwood Estates should be. The clash of ideologies was stark. On one side stood John, a man driven by a fierce commitment to personal freedom and the preservation of his heritage. On the other side was Karen, whose unwavering belief in uniformity and order defined her every action. The ensuing conflict was not just a battle over a strip of land. It was a struggle for the soul of the community, a contest between the right to individuality and the demands of a rigid system. In this charged atmosphere, every interaction, every whispered conversation, and every public statement became a battlefield. The tension was palpable, and as the conflict deepened, it became increasingly clear that Oakwood Estates was on the brink of a significant transformation. John's determination to reclaim his rights and challenge the oppressive authority of the HOA was setting the stage for a confrontation that would shake the very foundations of the community. The escalating conflict brought with it a sense of urgency. Residents who had long tolerated the HOA's authoritarian practices began to question whether the price of conformity was too high. As the debate intensified, it became apparent that the stakes were far greater than a mere piece of property. They were about the right to live freely, to honor one's personal history, and to resist an overbearing system that prized appearances over substance. Thus, as the days turned into nights filled with restless determination and whispered conspiracies, the battle lines were drawn. The once placid neighborhood of Oakwood Estates was now a microcosm of a larger societal struggle between the forces of rigid control and the resilient spirit of individuality. And amid the rising chorus of dissent, John Miller emerged as both a symbol and a catalyst. A man who refused to let his land, and by extension his identity, be diminished by the oppressive hand of conformity. In this crucible of conflict, every argument, every legal inquiry, and every act of defiance carried with it the weight of a revolution in the making. The tension was no longer just a simmering anger, but a full-blown confrontation between two worldviews that could no longer coexist quietly. The journey ahead was uncertain, fraught with challenges both legal and personal. Yet for John and his supporters, the battle for justice had already begun. With every passing day, the tension on John Miller's property grew as palpable as the summer heat. The 20-foot wall, erected piece by piece in defiance of the Homeowners Association's HOA dictates, had become much more than a physical barrier. It was a blazing symbol of rebellion, a monument to John's determination to reclaim not only his land but also his identity. The moment for decisive action had finally arrived, and John was ready to confront the oppressive system head-on. For months, John had endured the creeping encroachment of the HOA's regulations, the subtle yet relentless erosion of his personal rights. Every morning, the sight of that newly installed, towering barrier stirred a mix of anger and sorrow within him, a daily reminder that the institution he once trusted had overstepped its bounds. But as the injustice deepened, so too did his resolve. No longer could he stand by passively while his heritage was trampled under the guise of aesthetic consistency and community safety. One crisp early morning, with the weight of countless sleepless nights urging him forward, John made his decision. He would transform his sense of betrayal into an act of defiance. Armed with determination and a carefully devised plan, he mobilized a small group of trusted friends and neighbors who shared his belief in personal liberty. Together, they set out to build a new wall, a wall that would not only demarcate the disputed land, but also serve as a bold protest against the tyranny of conformity. The project began at dawn. John meticulously measured the boundaries of his property, marking the exact lines where the unauthorized construction had intruded. In a flurry of activity, the team began gathering construction materials, concrete blocks, reinforcing steel, and other supplies that would lend strength and permanence to the structure. Each brick and panel was handled with both care and conviction. Every element of the wall was imbued with the significance of a man reclaiming what was rightfully his. As the wall's first segments took shape, it became immediately apparent that this was no ordinary construction project. Standing nearly 20 feet tall, the structure was as imposing as it was symbolic. Its sheer scale was designed to challenge not only the physical boundaries imposed by the HOA, but also the metaphorical lines that had divided the community for far too long. The wall's raw, unyielding surface bore the marks of determination, a visible scar across the landscape that screamed defiance. News of John's daring undertaking spread like wildfire. Social media platforms buzzed with images and live updates from the construction site. Within hours, the hashtag #ReclaimOurLand trended locally, as people from across the community and beyond rallied around John's cause. The wall was no longer just a personal crusade. It had ignited a broader debate about property rights, individual freedom, and the overreach of institutional authority. Local news outlets quickly picked up the story, sending reporters to capture the unfolding drama. Journalists documented the scene with a mix of astonishment and intrigue. Here was a middle-aged homeowner standing against a powerful HOA, laying brick after brick as a statement of resistance. "It's a clear act of defiance," one reporter commented during a live broadcast. "John Miller is not merely building a wall. He's drawing a line in the sand against the erosion of personal rights." Such commentary only fueled the fire, and soon, images of the wall, with its stark contrast against the manicured lawns of Oakwood Estates, were splashed across newspapers and online articles. Amid the media frenzy, Karen, the relentless enforcer of HOA regulations, launched her own counteroffensive. Determined to quash what she saw as an act of lawlessness, she organized an emergency meeting of the HOA board. In a press conference broadcast on local television, Karen's tone was icy and defiant. "This wall is not just an eyesore. It is a blatant violation of our community's established standards," she declared. With rehearsed precision, she vowed that the HOA would take every legal measure necessary to dismantle the structure and restore order to Oakwood Estates. Her words, intended to reassure the conformist majority, instead only deepened the public's division, pitting the community's desire for order against the very real need for individual autonomy. The situation reached its boiling point when a live, televised debate was scheduled between John and Karen. The tension in the community was electric, and viewers tuned in by the thousands to witness the confrontation between the man defending his personal legacy and the emblem of the HOA's rigid authority. On one side, John stood resolute beside his creation, a man whose eyes shone with the fierce determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. On the other, Karen appeared polished and unyielding, her carefully maintained demeanor a stark contrast to the raw emotion radiating from her opponent. During the debate, John's voice was steady and clear as he explained his actions. "This wall is not a symbol of division, but a testament to my right to protect what I hold dear," he stated. "Every brick laid here represents the history of my family, the memories of childhood summers, and the unwavering spirit of independence. I built this wall to remind everyone that personal freedom should never be compromised by arbitrary rules." His words struck a chord with many viewers, resonating as a powerful call to action against the forces of conformity. Karen's rebuttal was swift and forceful. "You are undermining the very foundation of our community," she countered, her tone laced with a mixture of indignation and fear. "We are a community that thrives on order and uniformity. Allowing such acts of defiance not only sets a dangerous precedent, but also threatens the stability that we have worked so hard to maintain." The debate quickly escalated, devolving into a heated exchange of principles and ideologies. Social media erupted with reactions. Video clips of the confrontation were shared, commented on, and debated by thousands of residents, each adding their voice to the growing chorus of dissent. In the wake of the debate, the wall continued to stand as both a physical and symbolic barrier. As days turned into weeks, its presence began to reshape the very fabric of Oakwood Estates. By night, under the glow of streetlights, the wall became a canvas for expression. Some supporters painted messages like "freedom over conformity" in bold, defiant strokes, while detractors scrawled slogans decrying the act as rebellion without reason. These contrasting expressions encapsulated the broader struggle at play, a community divided between the sanctity of individual rights and the enforced uniformity of communal living. The widespread attention prompted a flurry of legal maneuvers. Local authorities were drawn into the fray, and legal experts began to scrutinize every aspect of the case. Lawyers on both sides pored over community bylaws and property rights statutes, seeking any legal precedent that could justify their position. While some saw John's wall as a reckless infringement on community standards, others argued that it was a legitimate act of self-defense against institutional overreach. The ensuing legal battle promised to be as protracted and contentious as the physical confrontation that had brought the matter into the spotlight. Amid this swirling maelstrom of public opinion and legal debate, John remained steadfast. Despite the pressure from both the HOA and the legal system, he found strength in the support of his neighbors and the outpouring of solidarity from across the nation. In private meetings and public rallies, residents shared stories of their own grievances, tales of minor transgressions turned into major disputes, and of lives quietly suffocated by an unyielding bureaucracy. It became evident that John's act of defiance had tapped into a deep well of shared frustration, igniting a spark of resistance that threatened to spread far beyond the boundaries of Oakwood Estates. One afternoon, as John stood before his wall surveying the community's reactions, he reflected on the journey that had led him to this defining moment. Every setback, every bureaucratic hurdle, and every moment of heartache had converged to create this singular act of rebellion. The wall was more than concrete and steel. It was a manifesto, a declaration that no one should ever be forced to sacrifice their identity for the sake of conformity. And as he gazed upon it, he realized that this was only the beginning of a much larger struggle, one that would challenge the very notion of authority and redefine the balance between collective order and individual freedom. The ripple effects of John's actions began to extend well beyond his own property. The local media, captivated by the dramatic narrative, began investigating other instances where homeowners had clashed with the HOA. What emerged was a pattern of quiet injustices that had long been ignored by a community too afraid to speak out. In neighborhoods across the region, whispers of similar battles grew louder, and residents began questioning whether the rigid systems governing their lives were truly in their best interests. As the legal challenges mounted and public demonstrations grew more frequent, the wall came to embody a duality, a structure both revered and reviled. It stood as a bold statement of individual rights, yet also as a stark reminder of the divisive nature of uncompromising authority. In every crack and chip, one could see the imprint of a struggle that was as much about personal dignity as it was about legal precedent. By the time local authorities announced that they would launch a formal investigation into the matter, the wall had already transformed the cultural landscape of Oakwood Estates. What began as a single man's desperate act of self-defense had snowballed into a movement, a challenge to the status quo that questioned the limits of communal power and the fundamental right to self-determination. In the days that followed, as debates raged in town halls and courtrooms, John Miller's wall remained steadfast, a silent guardian of a hard-won freedom. Its imposing presence served as a constant reminder to everyone that sometimes, the only way to reclaim one's space in the world is to build a barrier so high, so audacious, that it forces even the most powerful institutions to take notice. And so, as the sun set over Oakwood Estates, casting long, defiant shadows across the landscape, the community stood at a crossroads. The events of recent weeks had shaken the foundations of their world, challenging long-held beliefs about order, conformity, and the rights of the individual. In that moment, amid the echoes of heated debates and the silent vigil of a 20-foot wall, a new chapter was being written. A chapter defined by the courage to stand up for one's beliefs, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. John's act of defiance had become a beacon of hope for those who had long felt stifled by the rigid constraints of their community. His wall, towering and unyielding, was not merely a barrier. It was a call to action, a reminder that freedom is worth fighting for, and that every individual has the right to protect what makes them who they are. As the investigation loomed and the legal battles continued, the legacy of this audacious counterattack promised to endure far beyond the confines of Oakwood Estates. For in building that wall, John Miller had not only reclaimed his land, but had also carved out a space for debate, for change, and ultimately, for a future where personal freedom could once again take root in the heart of community life. In the weeks that followed the explosive media coverage and the public debate sparked by John Miller's audacious act, Oakwood Estates began to change irrevocably. The once serene suburb, defined by its meticulously trimmed lawns and strict conformity, was now the stage for a dramatic showdown between personal liberty and institutional control. What began as a single homeowner's protest had ignited a firestorm that threatened to upend not only the local community but also the very principles that governed it. The government steps in. As news of the 20-foot wall spread beyond Oakwood Estates, local government officials and law enforcement agencies found themselves drawn into a complex dispute. Initial reports described the wall as an unauthorized structure that not only violated the homeowners association's covenants but also potentially breached local zoning laws. With mounting public pressure and a media frenzy that painted the incident as a symbol of widespread bureaucratic overreach, city officials announced that they would launch a formal investigation into both the wall and the actions of the HOA. At a press conference held in the town hall, the city's zoning commissioner emphasized the importance of due process. "We are aware of the claims being made by Mr. Miller and the concerns raised by our citizens," she said. "Our priority is to ensure that all parties receive a fair hearing and that the law is applied consistently." Yet behind her measured tone lay an unmistakable tension, a recognition that this case was not merely about a dispute over property lines, but about the balance of power between individual rights and collective regulations. The government's intervention lent an air of legitimacy to John's cause, even as it complicated the legal landscape. Independent legal experts weighed in, arguing that while homeowners associations are granted significant power to enforce community standards, they must operate within the bounds of state and local laws. The revelation that the HOA's actions might have overstepped legal boundaries sent shockwaves through the community and bolstered support for John's position. As government agencies began their investigations, the legal battle between John Miller and the HOA quickly escalated into one of the most closely watched civil disputes in recent memory. The case, framed as a conflict between the overreach of a powerful institution and the fundamental rights of an individual, soon attracted high-profile attorneys from both sides. In courtrooms filled with tense anticipation, the legal teams sparred over every detail of the case. John's lawyers argued that the wall was a necessary act of self-defense, a physical manifestation of his right to protect his property and his heritage from arbitrary encroachment. They presented evidence from property deeds, historical records, and expert testimonies that traced the long and intimate history of John's land. They contended that the wall, while dramatic, was an understandable response to a series of unilateral decisions made by the HOA without proper consultation or legal authority. On the opposing side, the HOA's legal team maintained that the association was simply enforcing long-standing community standards. They argued that every homeowner, including John, had agreed to abide by these rules upon moving into Oakwood Estates. Their legal briefs emphasized that order and uniformity were essential to preserving property values and ensuring the overall well-being of the community. In their view, John's construction of the wall was not a justified act of self-defense but rather a reckless defiance of the established order. The courtroom became a battleground for ideologies as much as for legal statutes. Expert witnesses testified about the importance of individual rights versus the need for communal harmony, while legal scholars debated whether the HOA's aggressive tactics constituted an abuse of power. The case was laden with nuances, with every ruling and objection drawing fresh comparisons to broader national debates over property rights and governmental regulation. Throughout the trial, public opinion remained sharply divided. Some citizens of Oakwood Estates saw the legal proceedings as a validation of John's struggle, a necessary reckoning against a system that had long prioritized aesthetics and conformity over personal history and individual freedom. Others, however, viewed the wall as an affront to the community's cohesion, a symbol of dangerous anarchy that threatened to dismantle the orderly way of life they cherished. Beyond the sterile confines of the courtroom, the case had profound implications for the community. John Miller's act of defiance had become a rallying cry for those who felt stifled by rigid, top-down authority. Across social media platforms, hashtags like #MyLandMyRights and #BreakTheWall began trending, as residents shared personal stories of conflicts with the HOA and expressed their desires for greater autonomy. Neighborhood forums, once focused on mundane topics such as landscaping tips and local events, were now alive with impassioned debates about the balance between community standards and individual rights. Grassroots groups began to form, with residents organizing meetings and peaceful protests. In one memorable town hall, a small group of neighbors presented a petition calling for a review of the HOA's policies, a petition that quickly garnered hundreds of signatures. At these gatherings, the discussion was not solely about John's case. It evolved into a broader dialogue about democratic governance in private communities, the limits of regulatory power, and the importance of preserving personal freedoms in the face of institutional overreach. Local artists and musicians also found inspiration in the unfolding drama. Murals depicting a towering wall juxtaposed with blooming wildflowers started appearing on community bulletin boards and even on the sides of some buildings. The wall had transcended its original purpose, emerging as a symbol of resistance and a catalyst for civic engagement. For many, it represented the enduring human spirit, the belief that one person's determination could spark a movement capable of challenging entrenched power structures. Yet not everyone was supportive. A vocal segment of the community, loyal to the HOA's vision of an orderly, uniform neighborhood, viewed the wall as a needless provocation. They argued that allowing such acts of defiance would lead to an erosion of community values and destabilize the social contract that held the suburb together. This division was palpable in every heated exchange at local meetings, where long-standing friendships were tested and new alliances formed along ideological lines. As the legal proceedings dragged on and government investigations continued, the future of Oakwood Estates, and indeed, the fate of John's Wall, remained shrouded in uncertainty. The court had yet to deliver a final verdict, and every new piece of evidence or testimony only deepened the complexity of the case. With each passing day, the wall stood not only as a barrier between John's property and the rest of the neighborhood, but also as a metaphor for the growing chasm between tradition and modernity, conformity and freedom. For John Miller, the ongoing legal battle was a bittersweet reminder that the fight for justice was far from over. Despite the overwhelming support from many corners of the community and the attention of the nation's media, he knew that the final outcome would have far-reaching consequences. If the court ruled in favor of the HOA, it would signal a victory for institutional power, reinforcing the notion that individual rights could be sacrificed for the sake of communal order. Conversely, if John prevailed, it would set a powerful precedent for personal autonomy in the face of overbearing regulations, a beacon for those who felt marginalized by bureaucratic authority. Even as debates raged and legal documents piled up, a sense of cautious optimism began to emerge among John's supporters. They saw the wall not as a permanent fixture of division, but as a starting point for broader reform. Community activists proposed initiatives to establish clearer guidelines for HOA actions, emphasizing transparency, due process, and homeowner participation in decision-making. They envisioned a future where the rules governing private communities were not imposed from above without recourse, but were the result of democratic deliberation and mutual respect. In public interviews, John remained measured and reflective. "This isn't just about a wall," he often said. "It's about reclaiming our right to live in a way that honors our past and protects our future. I built this wall as a statement of defiance, yes, but also of hope. Hope that one day, we can strike a balance between order and freedom, between collective well-being and individual rights." His words resonated with a generation increasingly disillusioned by impersonal bureaucratic systems and hungry for genuine change. As the investigation and trial continued, the community of Oakwood Estates found itself at a crossroads. The case was a microcosm of a larger national debate about the role of regulatory bodies, the limits of private power, and the importance of safeguarding individual liberties. The 20-foot wall, with its imposing presence and symbolic significance, had become a canvas upon which the hopes, fears, and aspirations of an entire community were projected. In the final analysis, the story of John Miller and his wall was far from over. The legal verdict remained pending, the community was still divided, and the government's intervention had only opened up new questions about the nature of authority in private neighborhoods. What was clear, however, was that the wall had irrevocably changed the landscape, not just of Oakwood Estates, but of the broader conversation about property rights, freedom, and the human spirit. As dusk fell over the community, casting long shadows over the wall's rugged surface, one could not help but reflect on its dual nature. It was at once a protective barrier and a bold invitation to challenge the status quo. It stood as a testament to the enduring struggle between order and autonomy, a challenge to any institution that sought to suppress the innate desire for self-determination. The legacy of that towering structure was destined to be debated for years to come. Would it be remembered as a monument to a man's stubborn defiance, or as a catalyst for a more open and democratic approach to community governance? The answer lay in the uncertain future of Oakwood Estates, a future where every brick of the wall symbolized both a battle fought and the promise of a new beginning. In this moment of suspense, the community, and indeed the nation, was left to wonder. Where should the line be drawn between necessary order and the inalienable right to personal freedom? And as the case continued to unfold, John Miller's wall remained, a silent yet powerful emblem of a struggle that was, in many ways, just beginning.